But in order to get the Union, in order to get this country, our fathers, the founders, needed to and did make a bargain with the slaveholders, or with slavery itself. They protected slavery in the Constitution. This was the founding bargain. And Lincoln believed, although that was regrettable, there was no way around it, and the bargain being made must be kept. As the United States expanded west of the Mississippi and then eventually to the Pacific, he and others found a way. You could protect slavery where it is, you could guarantee it where it exists, but not let it spread another inch. Everybody believed, whether in fact it was true or not as a matter of political economy, everybody believed that if slavery was not growing, it was dying. And here's how it would die. Slaves were reproducing at a fairly healthy rate. So imagine a planter with 20 slaves on his acreage, and they're producing a crop like cotton for the world market, but he's stuck with those acres that he has. More slaves are born. Yes, they'll work for him, but he's also got to take care of them, feed them, clothe them, give them medical care when they need it, and take care of them in their old age. More slaves on the same acreage, gradually that acreage will be producing less because the soils will start to exhaust themselves. So what you can see is the slaveholder's cost of living, his overhead is going to rise, his income is going to dwindle because he's trapped, he's confined, he's restrained, and ultimately what choice does he have but to let slaves go? And where will they go? Lincoln has an answer for that. He favored colonizing free slaves, voluntarily on their part to be sure, but he favored colonizing them either in Africa or the Caribbean or Central America, but somewhere outside the United States. He did not object to the objective of some people to make this country not only a free country, but an all-white country. You'll recall that on the day he was inaugurated, Abraham Lincoln endorsed an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. It would have been the 13th Amendment. It had passed Congress, both houses, going out to the states, and he was ready to give it a push in its favor. It would have guaranteed slavery forever against federal interference in the states that wanted to have it. The Congress is getting ahead of you. And maybe in the future the great emancipator will not be the President of the United States, it will be Congress that is celebrated. Example, we've already seen the first Confiscation Act, 1861. The Congress freed all slaves being used in the rebellion. We've already seen the Confiscation Act of 1862, in July of 62, Congress freed all the slaves of rebels. Granted, there are going to be some judicial complications in seeing that through, but that's what Congress has done. And that's not the end of it. In 1862, the Congress abolished slavery in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., with compensation to owners. And then, in the summer of 1862, the Congress abolished slavery in the territories. All those territories west of the states, all those areas west of the Pacific that are not yet states that belong to the United States, slavery was abolished there without compensation. That had been the big fight, the struggle, the subject of the big fight before the war. The Congress got ahead of it. So, Mr. President, you wait much longer, there's not going to be much left for you to do. So what's Lincoln going to do about them? Here's what we know. We know that the 7 days battles on the peninsula came to an end rather ignominiously for the Union at the beginning of July 1862. There is McClellan at Harrison's Landing on the Yorktown Peninsula. In the next few days, we can't be sure of the day, Lincoln decided that he would issue an Emancipation Proclamation. There is a direct connection between the failure of McClellan's campaign on the peninsula and Lincoln's decision to act. The first time he mentioned it to another soul, as far as we know, was on the 13th of July. So that's 12 days or so after the Peninsula Campaign ended. Lincoln was riding in a carriage to the funeral of an infant son of Secretary of War Stanton's, who had died as a result of some medical procedure going awry. Lincoln was riding with two of his cabinet members, including Secretary of State Seward, and out of the blue, he told them that he decided to free the slaves. And he was apparently prepared to issue it that very day or the next day, July 22nd. But Secretary Seward, who had time to contemplate this now several days, said, "Why don't you wait until we have a victory to back it up?" And he made the following case. Look at what is happening in this country. White men are killing one another because of you. You are the cause. And it's odd because white people don't like you very much. In other words, Lincoln calls these gentlemen in with the intent of insulting them. And it's best for all of us, and I guess by all of us he included the blacks, if we separate. And then came Antietam. Then came the Battle of Antietam, which qualifies under some definitions as a Union victory, the moment he'd been waiting for. And so 5 days later, he called his cabinet together and he told them. He said, when General Lee entered Maryland, I made a promise to myself and to my Maker that when Lee was driven out of Maryland, I would issue this proclamation.
Hello, I'm Joe Ryan. A comment or two is in order with regard to Professor Fogarty's quite good presentation of that box of time in which the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation materialized out of Lincoln's hands. The first 6 sections that I highlighted for you from Professor Fogarty's speech are objectively consistent with what we lawyers would present to a jury as truth in court. In other words, that information is based upon the totality of factual circumstances surrounding the issues in question, which the trial judge would admit into evidence. The ultimate test of truth in court being not so much what witnesses say, but what the evidence shows they did. Action, the truism goes, speaks louder than words. And measured by that standard, Professor Fogarty has done his students fine service in presenting to them the points that are made in those first 6 highlights. Without question, the founders made a bargain with the South over the institution of slavery for the simple reason that the North needed the South in 1787 when the Constitution was drafted to Philadelphia. You know, it was the principle of all for one and one for all against the world. And the great powers of Europe were definitely large cannibals, eager to eat up all of the vast amounts of territory on the North American continent not then occupied by the colonies. And to stave off that pressure from England, from France, from Spain, the North had no choice if it wanted the United States to survive as a nation state in the community of nations, but to accept the institution of slavery. And there are 3 points in the Constitution where the recognition of slavery as a constitutional right are recognized. Now, the Republicans clearly breached that agreement by 1860. The Republicans, that is the radicals, who were leading the party, leading the charge, supported by the great mass of ordinary Republicans, did not want Africans to migrate into the territories regardless of their status as slaves or free men. You see, one of the great myths the historians, for all practical purposes up until our recent day, have been white men perpetuate is the myth that the Civil War was caused by slavery. It's a convenient abstraction when the reality of racism is clearly, from the point of view of the trial court, the cause of the Civil War. Now, Professor Fogarty on point 3 did get a little out there on the horizon when he made this point that slavery would die when the slave owners had no economic choice but to let the slaves go. That's precisely the problem that historians are not willing, apparently still to this day, to focus on in front of their student audiences. That's an impossibility. Let them go in that context. Excuse me, Professor, do you mean that these Africans now are going to be roaming the countryside in what has apparently been the collapse of a civilization without check, without control? Just stating the concept shows how ludicrous the idea is. Which brings us back again to the reality of racism in America in 1860. permeating the minds of all white men, regardless of whether they resided above or below the Mason-Dixon line. The idea of living side by side with an African in some sort of social state was not tolerable. Point 4 that Professor Fogarty gives us about Lincoln favoring colonization of the free slaves. Again, an example of white racism and how ludicrous the situation was. That the best the president could come up with to offer the country was the idea that some 4 million of Africans, men, women, and children, were going to somehow be transported physically from the shores of America to a impoverished place like Haiti or Liberia in Africa, even further. The cost involved, assuming we could have generated the capital to fund such a transfer of human cargo, how long would it have taken? How many ships carried how many souls over how many years? Just ridiculous. And nowhere in Professor Fogarty's presentation does he acknowledge that. His 6th point, which really is the crux, the key, the center of the story. This business about Congress getting ahead of Lincoln. You know, in his speech, in his presentation, Professor Fogarty in the beginning mentioned the Crittenden proposals in the 37th Congress, you know, about leaving slavery alone, etc., etc. Well, those proposals came out of the first session of the 37th Congress, which convened on July the 4th, 1861, and it adjourned in September 1861. That's why we have one little volume here. And at the time that this session existed, the senators, there were still many senators, several senators at least, from the slave states that had not departed and were still in their seats. John C. Breckinridge, the Vice President of the United States, was sitting in that session as a senator from the state of Kentucky. And the mood of the Congress at that time, there were many Democrats, many more Democrats in that session than there was going to be in the second session, which would occur in December of 1861, just after the November elections, which swept into office many Republicans. Back in that first session, many Democrats were striving to figure out a way that they could placate the South, massage the South, to cease being warlike in their behavior. But nowhere in his presentation did Professor Fogarty make any mention of the second session, which is here in front of us with 4 volumes of the court reporter's record, a transcript of every day of the proceeding, recording every word the senators made. And if that's disappointing for any student that wants to rise above the average on the bell curve and get up into that rarefied atmosphere of those A pluses, you got to do a little bit more investigation than Professor Fogarty apparently expects you to perform. Now, I appreciate that's a massive undertaking to read these 4 volumes. There are several thousand pages of very fine print, but the content is out. It's just an amazing story to read. The way it's as if you were present at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention in 1787, listening to Washington and Jefferson and Madison and all the rest of them, Adams, speak. Because these senators in the Senate during the second session of the 37th Congress of the United States were in exactly the same shoes as the representatives to the Constitutional Convention. On the one hand, you had radical Republicans, then you had what we call conservative Republicans, which are basically neo-Democrats. And then we have, representing all of the border states that are still there, Democrats. And these three groups, just the members of these groups made outstanding speeches that show you great insight and great analysis of the concept of the Constitution, how it was framed, what the framers intended the meaning of these various provisions to be. Just an outstanding presentation, and you can find an abbreviated but verbatim. I've abbreviated it, but the guts of it, the substance of it, the key arguments made by all the personalities are recorded in what you can find under the button of original works in JoeRyanCivilWar.com. There's a series of pieces called What Happened This Month During the Civil War. And if you go to what happened in February of 1862 and you carry that through to July of 1862 when the second session adjourned, I think you're going to get a much better understanding of this business Professor Fogarty just skipped over in the flash of an eye when he says Congress will get ahead of Lincoln, and Lincoln apparently doesn't want this to happen. He mentions the Confiscation Act of 1862, he mentions abolishing slavery in the territories of the District of Columbia, but those are just throwaway lines without any discussion of the substance of what happened during that incredible session. You see, what in essence happened is that with all the Democrats gone, except for those in the border states, the radicals gaining more and more control. At the same time, in terms of military control, Lincoln's government is gaining a grip on the social structure of Kentucky and Missouri and Western Tennessee, and it's no longer in Maryland. It's no longer becoming possible. It's no longer possible for the people in these border states to assert themselves militarily as aligned with Confederacy. And as that military grip buttons down those communities, the Republicans get more and more aggressive in the second session, pushing the idea that it is the Congress by an enactment that's going to free all the slaves for a variety of reasons. Professor Fogarty goes to some length about 8 points he's making about the reasons for this. And all of these points are indeed expressed by one or the other of these senators. But underlying it all in that session, when you read the transcript, what shocks you is the racism that is palatable in the chamber, in the Senate chamber of the United States during that session. It's racism that's motivating these men in great numbers, except for that very small handful of radical Republicans led by the senators from Massachusetts, King and what's that fellow's name? Now, when you get to point 7, as you noticed as I commented with titles over the images of Professor Fogarty making his speech, he makes the bold announcement that there's a, quote, direct connection between the 7 days battles and Lincoln's decision to issue the proclamation. Now, that's disappointing, because if the poor gentleman, if he was in a courtroom on a witness stand opining such a statement, he'd be ripped to shreds. He'd be lacerated. He has absolutely no factual basis to support that statement. It's a figment of his imagination and the imaginations of American historians generally. They don't want to recognize, for some reason, the idea that it was the activities that occurred in the second session in the Senate and in the House, the arguments that were made and reported on a daily basis, that influenced him. And you can find that in his own writings that Professor Fogarty didn't think it necessary to share with you. Professor Fogarty talks about in point 8 that the first time Lincoln mentioned his interest in proclaiming the slaves free was on July 13th in a carriage ride. Now, the historians get that from a piece of fiction, which they, we're back to the difference between the truth of history and truth in court. The difference between clinging to what witnesses say versus understanding with clarity what in fact they did. This is an example. He's talking about the diary, quote, the diary of Gideon Welles. This is not a diary. This is a piece of fiction. This is a work, this is a narrative of literature that surfaced after Gideon Welles' death. The first several chapters, his son, who, quote, edited this, quote, diary, unquote, admits he wrote himself. The son fabricated the first portions of this diary, and it's the son's narrative that we're reading here. And getting to that carriage ride. That carriage ride appears in this book. This is volume 1 of a 3-volume set. In chapter 2, as the lead-off paragraph, here's how it reads. On Sunday, the 13th of July, 1862, President Lincoln invited me, Gideon Welles, to accompany him in his carriage to the funeral of an infant child of Mr. Stanton. It was on this ride that Lincoln first mentioned to Mr. Seward, who apparently is in this carriage, and to me, the subject of emancipating slaves by proclamation. This was, he said, the first occasion when he had mentioned the subject to anyone. Now please, Professor, it's just not reasonable to be inoculating your students with the silliness that this was true. This was a true statement of fact. All we can know with any degree of certainty is that apparently Lincoln made the statement Wells's son records for us to Welles on or about July 13th during a carriage ride. But we all know that Lincoln and Seward walked hand in hand, that they were partners in the entire situation, and that they set themselves apart from the other members of their cabinet. And so the idea that Gideon Welles would learn about this idea at the same time that Lincoln's good friend Seward would learn about it just doesn't ring true in a courtroom. Now, was it the first time? Of course not. As Professor Fogarty tells us briefly, he mentions Second Confiscation Act. And the history of this act really tells you the whole story here. This act was sent to Lincoln's desk on or about July the 14th. Now, July the 14th is a Monday, July the 13th being a Sunday. Now, Lincoln certainly knew the content of this proposed bit of legislation well before Sunday of July the 13th. It had been argued about through the entire 4 months of the second session, almost on a daily basis. Vehemently argued about. So he had to have been aware of this before the carriage ride. And among other pieces in here that's of interest is Section 6, which has the kernel, the core of what later becomes the Emancipation Proclamation. And be it further enacted that if any person within any state of the United States, other than those named as aforesaid, after the passage of this act, being engaged in armed rebellion against the government, shall not, within 60 days after public warning and proclamation duly given and made by the President, cease to aid the rebellion, all his property is confiscated. Now, it's that issue, this idea about how are we going to confiscate all of the property of a person living in states that have lawfully seceded from the Union. How are we going to do that? Well, the senators, you know, these radicals, they want to do it by fiat, under the guise of a law. Lincoln understands that the veneer of law, hiding the arbitrary, tyrannous action of the senators, is so thin that he really has no choice but to turn outside of law, outside of the constitutional frame of law, to the law of war. And even in turning to the law of war, he's going to make new law there, because the law of war did not allow, did not authorize, did not recognize the idea that an enemy who's invaded your territory can lawfully strip you as a civilian now, not a soldier, but a civilian, strip you of all your property. Take your real estate, take your home, take your personal property. Just take it. That is not something the law of war recognized then, outside of the Lincoln government's interpretation of it, and even up to this day. Now, Professor Fogarty didn't even mention to you what Lincoln has recorded of having written at this particular time frame. If you go to his collected works, volume 5, and take a look, you say, well, what was happening? What is documented as having happened in this little window of time? Well, on July the 11th, 1862, Lincoln ordered Henry Halleck to Washington and appointed him General-in-Chief. He's intending now to totally reconstruct the way we're going to do business militarily. On July 12th, which is the Friday of the weekend, Saturday, he calls in the representatives. The Congress is now adjourned. it adjourned on Friday, the 11th, when it sent to his desk the proposed act of confiscation. He's called into his office the representatives of the border states, and he's read to them this memorandum, which is recorded in his papers. Let me read just a little bit of it so you get the flavor of what is obviously going on in his mind before he gets in the carriage that Gideon Wells wants to tell us about. Gentlemen, if you all had voted for the resolution of the gradual... Gentlemen, if you all had voted for the resolution in the gradual emancipation message of last March, the war would now be substantially ended. Huh? You see, we're back to the realm of racism. Had this idea of gradual emancipation with compensation that President Lincoln did in fact offer to the Congress in March of 1861, of 1862, it would have meant that this economic disaster that Professor Fogarty tells us was the inevitable result coming down the pike as the slaveholders got squeezed by the absence of more land, letting their slaves go. That economic disaster, that social disaster, would have been avoided if, say, in 1850, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay and all of the other lesser lights had stood up in the Senate and made that proposal, and had passed a law to fund it, had made money available from the United States Treasury to pay X number of dollars to a slave owner for each of his slaves, and then made arrangements for those Africans, no longer slaves now, but free men, whatever that means, to take up a new residence in the territories, in Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, California, New Mexico. Give them 40 acres and a mule and enough money and supplies to last them a year, and then they're on their own. If that concept had been debated, seriously considered in 1850, and money would have been appropriated, how many of us here think there would have been a civil war? Well, what prevented these people from doing that in 1850? Why not even a whisper of that in 1850? Because it was white men in the North who were looking to the territories as their private field of profit, of economic enterprise, bringing these millions of immigrants flowing into the country from Germany and Ireland out onto those Great Plains so they could sell them all of the equipment and material and household goods they need to survive. And none of those people wanted to live side by side with Africans. White racism. So President Lincoln has come a little late to that party. And he goes on in this thing to say this. Let the states let the states which are in rebellion see definitely and certainly that in no event will the states you represent ever join their proposed confederacy. And they cannot much longer maintain the contest. But you cannot divest them of their hope to ultimately have you with them, so long as you show a determination to perpetuate the institution within your own states. You prefer that the constitutional relation of the states to the nation shall be practically restored without without disturbance of the institution. And then he gives this is written and presented, as I say, on July the 12th. The next day, according to Gideon Wells, Lincoln's in a carriage with him. This is his state of mind, Lincoln's state of mind on the 12th. He's already foreshadowing what's been obviously in his brain for months. If the war continue long, as it must, if the object of freedom for slaves be not sooner attained, the institution in your states will be extinguished by mere friction and abrasion, by the mere incident of the war. It will be gone, and you will have nothing valuable to show for it. He goes on. I do not speak of emancipation at once, but of a decision at once to emancipate gradually. Room in South America for colonization can be obtained cheaply and in abundance, and when numbers shall be large enough to be company and encouragement for one another, the freed people will not be so reluctant to go. So you see, Lincoln is, to me this is veiled threat. He's called these representatives into his office. He's read this to them. He does this at a time when they have handed him for a signature the second act of confiscation, which is still being modified. Negotiations are going on between him and the leaders of Congress over modifying certain words and phrases in the document. It's their last chance, if one's intelligent, reads between the lines, before something more draconian will be put in place. And then he goes on to emphasize the difficulties that he's under. He says, I am impressed with the difficulty not yet mentioned. General Hunter is an honest man. Now, General Hunter is a general in command of the area in South Carolina that is occupied by the Union Army along the seashore. He has proclaimed all men within certain states to be free, and I have repudiated the proclamation. Yet in repudiating it, I gave dissatisfaction, if not offense, to many who support the company cannot afford to lose. And this is not the end of it. The pressure in this direction is upon me and is increasing. So here at the very verge of entering the carriage to disclose to Gideon Wells what he and William Seward had been scheming about for weeks, if not months, he's giving warning here to the representatives of the border states to watch out, that something's going to come down if they don't become more pliable with regard to announcing their willingness to gradually emancipate their own slaves. And what's at the bottom of all of this is the fact that he still has only a tenuous grasp on the spirit of the people who live in Missouri and Kentucky and Western Tennessee. And he knows it. He knows he's holding them in line, really, through military power more than anything else. And then here on this, at the same time, he sends the draft of a bill to compensate any state which may abolish slavery within its limits to the Congress that is ending its session on July the 14th. And the session ends without the Congress taking any action on that. Then we come to Professor Fogarty's point 11. Then came the Battle of Antietam. And Professor Fogarty regurgitates the historical line that this great victory that General McClellan obtained over General Lee at Antietam accounts for the fact that on September the 22nd, 1862, the Lincoln White House released to the public the written version of what is called the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. There's supposed to be a direct cause and effect relationship between the issuance of the proclamation on that date and the happening of the Battle of Antietam, but nothing further can be from the objective truth. Think about it. Think about it. What was happening on September the 22nd, 1862? Confederate armies were occupying almost one half of the state of Kentucky. The Confederate Army was occupying the state capital of Kentucky. General Braxton Bragg, commanding the army, was at a point on the Green River, an equal distance between Nashville and Louisville, waiting for Carlos Buell to arrive at his front with the Union Army and give him battle. And from the perspective of President Lincoln in the White House in Washington, looking out across the country with his mind's eye, not knowing what's happening, not having good communication with what's happening out there in the middle of Kentucky on July the 19th, the 20th, the 21st, the 22nd. Does he fear? I think a reasonable person in his shoes would certainly fear the outcome of this impending confrontation between the Union Army under Buell and the Confederate Army under Bragg on the Green River. That a battle of the same magnitude that McClellan faced with General Lee at Sharpsburg isn't going to unfold at the Green River, and that the outcome will be as tenuous as it was with General Lee. And what will happen if Bragg is successful in repulsing Buell and holding his own at the Green River and maintaining his position, if not going on to the offensive and chasing Buell back to Nashville? What is happening in Kentucky must go through President Lincoln's mind at this time. The young men of this state, which he's just told the representatives a couple of days before he acknowledges his tenuous control over, aren't going to suddenly rise up in their passion and flock to the Confederate banner, and the entire state will once again be up in rebellion. So, from the courtroom point of view, with President Lincoln on the witness stand, and some reasonably intelligent lawyer cross-examined him with the strength of the objective facts in his hand, President Lincoln's going to have a hard time convincing a jury in the jury box that he didn't release this proclamation at that moment as a warning, not to Virginia and her allies, which were never coming back to the Union by consent, but to warn the people of Kentucky that if they get out of line, they're going to find themselves living among free Africans. And that freedom to the Africans will be eventually imposed by the military might of the Union.
I